All right, welcome back to history class. He does have it set up as a history class, which is pretty cool. So this is John Green, crash course on U.S. history, taxes, and smuggling. The thing that started the war for independence, the thing we are burning with today, taxes, right? Anyway, let's go ahead and get this video started.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we begin discussing the American Revolution. So, two things to keep in mind here. One, the American Revolution and the American War for Independence are not the same thing.
Actually, in my school, we didn't even reference American Revolution or call it the American Revolution because the teachers didn't want to confuse it with the French Revolution because we all know that the French gave revolution a bad name. Anyway,
And two, while I know this will upset some of you, the American Revolution was not really about taxes. Mr. Green, it was about tea, right? Also, it was not about tea. The Boston Tea Party was about taxes and our God-given right to smuggle. It's a little confusing me from the past, but that's why Crash Course is here.
thank you, Crash Course.
So as you'll recall, the Seven Years' War ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, which made the colonists cranky because it limited their ability to take land from the Indians, and it also left them holding the bag for a lot of war debt. Wars, as you may have noticed, are expensive, and the British government had to borrow 150 million pounds, and the interest payments on that money ate up half of the national budget. So in order to pay for the war, the British decided to raise taxes. And since the primary beneficiaries of the war had been the American colonists, the British government felt it was only fair if some of the burden fell to them. Now,
Even though they did raise taxes in England, which caused a lot, I won't say a lot, but there were a lot, not a lot. There were riots in England over the taxes.
taxes on colonial trade were nothing new. The British government had placed taxes on a bunch of items in order to reduce competition with Britain, including wool and hats and molasses. Why did they place a tax on molasses? It doesn't seem like that would be a huge market. Oh, molasses. Right, of course. But those taxes were about trying to regulate trade in a mercantilist way more than trying to pay back war debt, and also they were easy to avoid via smuggling, which we did because this is America.
Yeah, America. Now, you do have to take into account that the I lost my train of thought here. Um, anyway, it'll come to me.
But mostly the colonists were angry because they didn't have any say about the new taxes that Britain was imposing.
Yeah, they weren't represented in Parliament, basically.
I mean, after all, by 1760, some colonies had been setting their own taxes through their own legislatures for 100 years. So
As I said before, it's all because Great Britain didn't want anything to do with them until King George III came up and saw that he could increase his wealth. What I was going to say about the mercantilist system is the mercantilist system is another reason why you should never mix government with the economy. Never comes out good, whether it's done by kings, whether it's done by representatives, no matter who it's done by. It's never good to mix economy with government.
But the taxes themselves weren't really the problem. It was their lack of parliamentary representation. The first purportedly oppressive tax, the Sugar Act of 1764, extended the Molasses Act by changing the tax on imports from the Caribbean from 6 cents per gallon all the way up to 3 cents.
What a discount. And on that note about representation, they wanted to be seen as Englishmen. So when they felt that they weren't seen as Englishmen and they weren't represented, it left them wondering, well, are we really British?
Per gallon. So they actually cut the tax, but they decided to start enforcing it by stamping out smuggling. And to that end, the act also gave British courts the right to try colonial smugglers, taking that power away from colonial courts, which had been notoriously lenient when it came to smuggling on account of how they enjoyed smuggled rum as much as the next guy.
I'm pretty sure that a lot of those smugglers were also their friends, probably received money from them, maybe even were involved in the business themselves. things to that nature. So England said enough is enough.
But those initial acts weren't nearly as annoying as the Stamp Act, passed in 1765. The Stamp Act declared that all printed material had to carry a stamp. Unsurprisingly, that stamp was not free. This was purely to gain revenue for Britain, and it mostly affected people who used a lot of paper, like newspaper printers and lawyers, just the kind of people you want to anger about taxes. So in October, protesters organized the Stamp Act Congress, which after a meeting decided to boycott British goods. And this was the first major coordinated action by all the colonies together, and it might be the first time that we can speak of the colonies acting in a united way, almost like, say, a government. Committees of correspondence, which had been created to encourage opposition to earlier acts, now grew to coordinate the boycott efforts, and they helped people become more aware of their liberties, and they also spurred street actions that occasionally became violent.
Yeah, hanging effigies of King George III, assaulting public buildings, and by public buildings, I mean government-run buildings. And I know that they attacked the house of Governor Hutchinson up in Massachusetts. There was an attack on the governor in Virginia. I do not recall his name at the moment, but yes, they did riot. There were a lot of riots directed at government. Yeah, directed at the government.
These direct actions were organized by groups calling themselves the Sons of Liberty, and guess what? Coordinated action worked.
Yeah, about the Sons of Liberty, there's a show by that name done by the History Channel, and let's just say it's not historical, but it's done by the History Channel.
The British Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, but they did pass the Declaratory Act, which was all like, listen, you're not the boss of us. We can tax you. We don't want to tax you right now as it happens, but we could if we wanted to, but we won't, but we could. So the repeal of the Stamp Act was seen by many in the colonies as a huge victory, but most of the people organizing the protests were elites, the kind of people who use paper. But once you start talking about the idea of representation, everybody wants in. Meanwhile, Great Britain still needed money, so Chancellor of the Exchequer Charles Townshend got Parliament to pass new taxes in 1767. The so-called Townshend Acts also created a new board of customs to stop smuggling, which we didn't like one bit. You don't like it when I say we? Well, tough luck. I'm an American. Bring back the Libertage, Stan!
There we go. Yeah. America.
Many colonists again responded with a boycott, and women got in on the act this time, with the Daughters of Liberty encouraging homespun clothes to replace British ones. But not all the states were on board. Like, artisans loved the boycotts because they got more money. But merchants from cities like Philadelphia and New York weren't so happy because they made their livings by importing and selling the very goods that were now being boycotted.
And if you have ever watched Johnny Tremaine, which is a show based on a book but the show was done by Disney in the 1950s, you will see that Johnny Tremaine's uncle is one of these merchants who is affected by the boycotts. And he's really upset about it. And that is where you start seeing the division between Tories, what would later become Tories and Patriots.
On occasion, protests did get out of hand, as in the Boston Massacre of March 5th, 1770, which, while it was not much of a massacre, was definitely the worst out.
Yes, and Paul Revere actually came up with this sketch here, and he was trying to rile up the people. As you can see, this British soldier looks like he's very happy to be shooting at the crowd, when in reality, these men were panicked and shot, and just shot when they felt threatened. And John Adams ended up coming and defending these men in court, where they were eventually let go. Maybe one was condemned, I can't remember, but all of them were let go, and the one that was condemned only, I think, got jail time or something like that.
Outcome of a snowball fight in American history. I mean, 5 colonists were killed, including most famously Crispus Attucks, a sailor of mixed-race ancestry. And then of the 9 British soldiers put on trial, 7 were acquitted and 2 were convicted only of manslaughter, thanks to the top-notch lawyering of one John Adams.
So I was close, too. Got one wrong. There was one more.
Don't worry, though, that guy comes around to the American cause. But overall, boycotts and protests were effective, and British merchants pushed for the repeal of these acts, leaving only a tax on tea. Let's go to the thought bubble. The 1773 Tea Act offered tax exemptions and rebates for tea coming in from the British East India Company, which...
There you go. Crony capitalism back in the 1700s.
Allowed them to dump cheap tea on the colonies, which actually lowered the price of tea. So why were the colonists so mad that on December 16th, 1773, they dressed up as Indians and dumped enough tea into Boston Harbor
I like that, the little halo sword. That's funny.
to cause the modern equivalent of a $4 million loss? Some colonists were upset that cheap tea would cut into the profits of smugglers and established tea merchants, but most were just angry on principle. To our great national shame, tea was at the time as important a beverage in the colonies as it was to Brits living in Britain, and to allow the British to tax a near universal product set a precedent that Britain could tax whatever they wanted. But the Tea Partiers miscalculated, thinking that the British would back down in response to their protest. Instead, the British responded by passing a series of acts that colonists came to call the Intolerable Acts.
So we dumped the tea, never looked back, and now we all drink coffee. That's why there's a Starbucks at every corner.
The Massachusetts Government Act curtailed self-government there. The Quartering Act forced colonists to house British soldiers in their homes when ordered to. The Quebec Act extended the southern boundary of Quebec and granted religious toleration to Catholics, which was none too popular with the Great Awakening.
Now, some of it had to do with Catholicism, but more because Catholicism was going to be allowed to get to their back door, because the Quebec Act basically gave what today is Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan to Quebec, to that territory of Quebec, which was run by French. And the some of the Catholicism was that it established it as the official religion of Quebec, and even the British that lived in Quebec, some of them moved out because they feared being persecuted, things like that. But to say that it was because there was this really strong intolerance against Christians at this time. Not really. Maryland had a lot of Catholics in it. Philadelphia had some Catholics in it. Signers of the Declaration of Independence were Catholic. Members of the Continental Congress were Catholic. So it wasn't as intolerable as it sounds like he is trying to make it sound like. The worst part of the Quebec Act was giving Quebec the territory like Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois. That probably aggravated, especially landowners, a little bit more.
Crowd having recently awoken. The colonial response to these acts is really the start of the American Revolution. First, Massachusetts passed a set of resolutions calling for colonists to 1. Disobey the Intolerable Acts, 2. Stop paying taxes, and 3. Prepare for war. And
Imagine today if you stopped paying taxes. My word.
in September 1774, a group of delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies, Georgia, met in Philadelphia to coordinate the resistance of the Intolerable Act. This was the First Continental Congress, which in setting up the Continental Association to police the boycott and encourage domestic manufacturing was the first real colony-wide government in British America. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So this sort of phenomenon is known by historians as kind of a big deal. I mean, coordinating action to achieve some end is what governments do, so it's not an exaggeration to say that the First Continental Congress was the first government of America. You might even say that sending delegates to Philadelphia in 1774 was the first truly revolutionary act of the American Revolution, but it was not a call for independence. However, there was a changing attitude among many colonists, because rather than seeing themselves as standing up for their rights as English people, they began to make claims based on abstract ideas about freedom and natural rights. In this respect, the Continental Congress was between worlds, because it justified its actions as liberties of free and natural-born subjects within the realm of England, but it also talked about immutable laws of nature. And this
See, this is my problem with this secularist view of U.S. history. They like to throw out Christianity and God and all that. If you study John Locke and Montesquieu, the two men that the founding fathers read and emulated their political thought and put it into practice, both of those men talked a lot about natural rights, but both of them equated natural rights with God. And they both were very clear in their writings that God was the one who has put down the natural rights that cannot be changed. And secularists don't like talking about it, but that's just what it is. The founding fathers did not borrow from Rousseau and Voltaire, who said that society is the one who determines rights. And that is the main reason why the French Revolution and the American Revolution are so different is because the American Revolution was based on God, on the natural rights that God has given to men that cannot be violated by any government, that cannot be changed by any government. They're just given laws that are given rights. While in the French Revolution, society sets the rights, and that's how you get Robespierre. So it is very clear to make that connection. But secularists, like I'm sure John Green, don't like to throw that in. Notice nothing about God. He will eventually, well, we'll get there.
The idea that all humans have certain rights derived from natural law has become a pretty big deal, not just in the United States, but also in the green lands of not America. I mean, these days, human rights is a phrase that we bandy about with Putin. Do you show up every time the words human rights are mentioned to make sure that we're talking about China and not you? And this brings me back to an important point. Although we tend to equate the two, the American Revolution and the American War for Independence were not the same thing. I mean, for one thing, the fighting started 15 months before the Declaration of Independence. For another, simply declaring independence does not make you an independent nation, as I will now demonstrate. I hereby declare this studio the independent nation of John Green, Sylvania. Yeah, see, nothing happened. The war between colonists and Britain began in 1775, on April 19th to be exact, when fighting broke out between the British soldiers and Massachusetts militiamen, the Minutemen, at Concord and Lexington, or Lexington and Concord, depending on whether you live in Lexington or Concord. This was the famous shot heard round the world, immortalized in Longfellow's poem The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. So while the colonists actually lost the famous Battle of Bunker Hill, which was technically fought on Breed's Hill, the British suffered such heavy casualties that soon thereafter they were forced to abandon Boston.
This is what's called now a Pyrrhic victory, where you may win the battle, but you lose a lot of soldiers in trying to do it, sometimes more than you can afford.
But then they got some revenge by taking over New York, which they held for most of the rest of the war. But in thinking about the war, it's very important to understand that not all colonists were pro-independence. Like elites in colonies like New York and Pennsylvania were very nervous about all this revolutionary fervor that was whipping up artisans and small-time farmers to think that they deserved to have say in the political process.
He may get to it. We'll see. I told you guys, I know this stuff. But the main leader of that movement to try to restore peace was a man named John Dickinson, a delegate from Pennsylvania. And he was requesting an olive branch petition to bring peace, and that was into King George, who rejected it. But he was very much wanting for peace. He didn't even approve of the Declaration of Independence or sign it. Ironically, he also was there to form the Articles of Confederation after the War for Independence, and was at the Constitutional Convention, where he also rejected the Constitution and advocated against it. So, yeah, he was very involved, but he was always against the grain. But you have to have some people like that sometimes.
Oh, it's time for the mystery document? Awesome, I love getting shocked. The rules here are simple. If I guess the author of the mystery document correctly, I do not get the shock pin. If I'm wrong, I do get the shock pin. All right, let's see what we got here. The Americans are properly Britons. They have the manners, habits, and ideas of Britons and have been accustomed to a similar form of government. But Britons could never bear the extremes, either of monarchy or republicanism. Some of their kings have aimed at despotism, but always failed. Repeated efforts have been made toward democracy, and they equally failed. If we may judge of future events by past transactions, in similar circumstances, this would most probably be the case in America, were a republican form of government adopted in our present ferment.
Republican form of government. There you go.
All right, so we've got an educated person who thinks that Americans are Britons who will inevitably want to walk a middle path between republicanism and monarchy, and therefore that the revolution is not a good idea. I know it's a colonist because of the reference to our present ferment. All right, I'm going to guess that it is Ben Franklin's son, William Franklin? Ah, dang it! Who is it? Who the hell is Charles Inglis? Charles Inglis? Charles freaking Inglis? I've never even heard of that guy. It's not fair.
Yeah, I've never heard of him either.
Ah! Oh, I hate that. Apparently he's a bishop or something. Anyway, people like Inglis remind us that not everyone in the colonies was all fired up to be an independent nation. In fact, in July of 1775, the Continental Congress sent the Olive Branch petition to
Called it.
King George III, suggesting that Americans were loyal British subjects who wanted reconciliation with the mother country. But then along came Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense. Why couldn't that have been the mystery document? Common Sense appeared in January of 1776, and it was like the Harry Potter of its time, only with liberty instead of wizard school. Written in relatively straightforward English, the pamphlet contains many powerful rhetorical arguments, like, of more worth is one honest man to society and in the sight of God than all the crowned ruffians that ever lived.
So Thomas Paine is an interesting character because, as you see back here, um, let's read a little bit of this. I'll tell you, friend, he reigns above, and doth not make havoc of mankind like the royal brood of Great Britain. Yet that we may not appear to be defective even in earthly honors, let a day be solemnly set apart for proclaiming the charter. Let it be brought forth, placed on the divine law, the word of God. Let a crown be placed thereon, by which the world may know that so far as we approve of monarchy, that in America the law is king. So in this pamphlet, actually, throughout it, he makes a strong case using the Old Testament and the idea of how Israel was a group of tribes who ended up putting a king over themselves, and how God really didn't want them to have a king. He wanted to be their king. And just the idea um, of placing divine law, the word of God, to be that authority shows that it was very common among the founding fathers, that that was where they were headed to, where they were going to make the word of God and the divine law the law of the land. And he wrote this. Now he did admit he was a deist. I can't remember if that was during this time or later when he went to France. When he did go to France, he was very against, uh, turned very antagonistic against religion. I don't know what happened. I don't know if he was more Christian before he went, but something about going to France, Thomas Jefferson, the same thing. Something about going to France gets you atheist for some reason. Anyway,
Of more worth is one honest man to society and in the sight of God than all the crowned ruffians that ever lived. Others were just common sense, like this nugget. There is something absurd in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island.
there you go.
Pow!
Great
Also, there's the
reason.
beautiful sentiment, the weapon we have is love. Oh, that's from Harry Potter? I told you they were similar. Ultimately, Paine's arguments all contributed to the idea that America is somehow special, even exceptional. I mean, talking about independence and freedom, he said, the cause of America is in great measure the cause of all mankind.
So there you have it. We get exceptionalism and related to America from Thomas Paine.
That's powerful stuff, and Paine's pamphlet sold 150,000 copies, and it was extremely widely read. By the way, he still managed to die penniless, and only 8 people attended his funeral because of his vitriolic ridicule of Christianity. But anyway, America eventually declared independence for many reasons, but Paine's persuasive arguments were one important reason. And it marks a moment when the pen truly was, if not more powerful, then at least more important than the sword. I mean, within 6 months of the publication of Common Sense, the Second Continental Congress had declared independence and signed one of the most important documents in the history of the world, which is where we'll pick up next week. Thanks for watching. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller. Our script...
So that was a good video. Of course, besides the fact that he's trying to hide the Christian part of our founding and trying to brush it over with the secularist nonsense. But besides that, pretty good video. I love how they're able to do all the stick figures or all the figures and cartoon figures and all that. That's pretty cool. I definitely wish I could do that. That's for sure. I envy them for that. Um, but yeah, that was a good video overall. It's interesting how he made that distinction between the American Revolution and War for Independence. So I guess there was that change going on, and that's the American Revolution, and then War for Independence. We're now independent, and I guess the American Revolution continued on afterwards, or maybe you can call it the Constitutional Revolution, however you want. But thanks for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please like, subscribe, share with your friends, especially if they're history buffs, and leave a comment below, even if it's a comment you disagree with. And leave a comment below. I don't mind responding. If you do, I would love to respond. If you think that there was something wrong, factually wrong with something I said, I would love to read that too. But thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.